Let's move on to the average rate. The average rate is a bit more complex than the current rate that we just looked at. The average rate is calculated by taking the weighted average rate for all transactions in a given accounting period, specifically looking at the impact of GL accounts that are measured at the average rate. We'll see more of that shortly. As an example, let's say we only had two transactions in the accounting period January 2023 for our Canadian entity. The first transaction is dated January 1st, the second transaction is dated January 2nd, and notice that we have two different exchange rates that are applied to those transactions. Now, in order to perform the calculation to obtain the average rate, we take the weighted average. So in other words, we take the transaction amount in Canadian dollars multiplied by the exchange rate. We do that for both of those transactions, and we divide it by the total combined transaction value to arrive at an average rate of 0.85. Now, it's very important that we know where these exchange rates are coming from. So they are not sourced from the transaction itself. In fact, the transactions that we're going to take a look at shortly are in Canadian dollar for an entity that is measured in Canadian dollar. In other words, the exchange rate on the transaction itself is 1. These exchange rates instead are sourced from the currency exchange rates table that looks at the currency pair of Canadian dollar to US dollar. And the reason that we're sourcing Canadian dollar to US dollar is because the parent entity is measured in US dollar. It's also important to note that the exchange rate types are set on the GL accounts themselves. Any account that is not measured at the average rate will be excluded from the average rate calculation. Let's jump into NetSuite and take a look. So we can see here from our consolidated exchange rates page that we have different consolidated exchange rates between our current, average, and historical for the Canadian dollar to US dollar pair here. So let's see how this 0.85 is derived within the system. Let's start by going to our currency exchange rates table and looking at the exchange rate between US dollar and Canadian dollar for January 1st, 2023. And we can see here that that rate is 0.9. As I mentioned earlier in the course, you have the ability to update exchange rates within NetSuite via CSV import, and that's why you see the method here is set to manual. Let's just validate the exchange rate for January 2nd, and you will see here that it has changed from 0.9 to 0.8, and we'll see why that makes a difference in a moment. Let's now take a look at those two transactions that were entered into the Canadian entity for January 2023. The first is a vendor bill that has two line items. One is coded to bank service charges, the other to inventory adjustments. Now this is key because again, we are only interested in accounts that are measured at the average rate. So let's quickly double check how these two accounts are measured. Jumping to the account for bank service charges, we can see here that the general rate type is average. In other words, for any transactions that are recorded to this GL account in NetSuite, those transactions will be measured and part of the weighted average calculation for the average consolidated exchange rate. When we move to the inventory adjustments account, we can see here that the general rate type is historical. In other words, any transactions that are allocated to this account will specifically be excluded from the weighted average calculation when looking for the average rate. Coming back to our second vendor bill then, very similar but dated January 2nd, we have two line items again for bank service charges and inventory adjustments. Now that we know the currency exchange rates differ for both days, and yet the bill value is the same, when we perform the weighted average calculation, we're going to take the weighted average of these two transactions, which brings us back to that 0.85 that we'd calculated before.